Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Matthew Harding. I'm the Dean of the Law School here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this book launch. Can I start by acknowledging the country? We're on Wurundjeri land here, land that's been held and cared for in custodianship for thousands of years through law. And I want to acknowledge that fact, and I want to acknowledge and pay respects to the elders of the Wurundjeri, past, present and emerging. Very warm welcome to any First Nations Australians who are here in the room, and to all of you. Well, tonight it's a very happy occasion. We're launching a book. Launching a book is a big moment, not least for the person who wrote the book.
That's the only person who wrote the book.
And a moment to be savoured. And so it's a particular delight to see so many people here on this occasion. The book, of course, is Tax and Government in the 21st Century. The title of the book tells you on its face about the significance of its contents. Nothing really could be more important to our society at this point in time than the topic of tax and government. And so we look forward to hearing more shortly about this important book and the themes on which it dwells. This is an event being auspiced by the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. Some of you were here in this room last year for the launch of that centre. It's a new centre which brings together a number of research communities and centres that have been active within the Melbourne Law School for some time, including the Centre for Corporate Law, and Ian Ramsey is here, the Tax Group, and other important research communities. But for the first time, these communities are brought together and can really speak with one coherent and integrated voice about a range of important questions of law and policy and regulation for our country and internationally. So it's very exciting to see the Centre now really getting into a program of events and activities, and of course this book launch is one such event. Miranda Stewart, who is the author of this book, is well known to most of you, I'm sure. She is an internationally recognised expert on tax law and policy. Her interests include the relationship of tax and gender equality, the legitimacy and fairness of tax systems, and how they support good government, as evidenced in this monograph. Miranda also has worked in the past with me on the tax and regulation of charity and philanthropic activity, and I was absolutely thrilled to see a whole chapter dedicated to that theme in the book. And we'll hear a lot more in a minute about this book, but can I just again congratulate you, Miranda, on a very significant achievement and a very significant contribution to legal scholarship. My last pleasure, you'll be pleased to hear, is to introduce the Honourable Justice Michelle Gordon, AO, who will be officially launching this book this evening. Justice Gordon, of course, is a Justice of the High Court of Australia. She was appointed to that court in 2015. Prior to that, she was a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, and before then, she was a barrister practising in state and federal courts in a range of fields: commercial, equity, general civil matters, and of course tax. She's a graduate of the University of Western Australia, and she was admitted to practice in that jurisdiction, but then joined the Victorian Bar in 1992. We are very proud that she's the professorial fellow of this law school, where she teaches on statutes and statutory interpretation, a topic of enormous importance to our students. Justice Gordon, it's our pleasure to have you this evening, and I'll hand over to you to launch this book.
Thank you. Daily we live, work and play on lands of the First Peoples, lands where they continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. as they have done for millennia. And I pay my respect to the traditional owners of all lands in Australia, but particularly today, to those peoples and their elders of the land on which we meet. That acknowledgement and giving of respect is important because it reminds us all that our community is not homogenous. I am absolutely honoured and delighted to be asked to launch Tax and Government in the 21st Century by the wonderful Professor Miranda Stewart. It's sort of difficult to actually go through all of her various roles, but one just stops and looks at a number of them. Not only is she Professor here at the Melbourne Law School, Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, International Research Fellow at the Centre for Business Taxation at the Surrey Business School at Oxford, to name just a few. So as I said, it's an absolute honour and delight of mine to be asked to launch this wonderful book. Professor Stewart provided me with a copy of the book before the summer break, accompanied by a handwritten note which read, "In case reading on the beach is an option." I don't know what it says about me or my family, but I diligently took the book to the beach. The younger member of my immediate family, holding the book in his hand, asked where I got the book, announcing, "This book's very good." When I told him that I'd been asked to launch the book, he promptly told me that he could contribute to the content of the speech, stating, and I quote, "Everyone should read this book, whether they are in government or private practice, involved in or with law, economics, governmental structure or policy, and private or public strategy." He's right. Well, in 12 years ago, I gave a speech here at the Australasian Tax Teachers Association conference, in which I looked at the relation between tax law and other areas of law, and the consequences for drafting and interpreting tax laws, as well as teaching tax law. I looked then at the effects of specialisation that exists in the tax profession, and in that connection referred to Professor Paul Caron's work, much earlier work, examining specialisation of tax lawyers, which he said created a culture of myopia and irrationality in so many areas. That speech and those complaints were directed to a very much narrower field than Professor Stewart examines in his wonderful text, Tax, Government and Government in the 21st Century. She examines the place of taxation and tax law in a much wider context. Having first identified the relevant concepts and principles, Professor Stewart looks at tax and its connections with work and family, taxation and its connections with savings and wealth, particular issues about corporate and business taxation, the relationships between tax, charity and philanthropy, and then the innumerable issues and consequences arising out of the administration of tax laws, including compliance with and avoidance of taxation requirements by taxpayers. The last 3 chapters of the book address global and digital challenges to the tax state. If you pause there, you will observe that Professor Stewart places tax in a much wider societal context than the bare examination of particular provisions of a particular tax regime would allow, and it is a much wider context, I suggest, than the context considered by many of those who write or apply tax laws. I speak of those who write or apply tax laws, but that is intended to cover everyone, from those who formulate policy, those who give instructions for the drafting of tax legislation, those who draft the laws, to those who then interpret it and apply it, as well as those exposed to it in every conceivable way. You may doubt that all of the contextual issues that Professor Stewart examines should be present to the mind of those who frame tax policy. But a question, which I think the work leaves for us all to consider, is how and to what extent the contextual elements that Professor Stewart identifies can or should affect those who interpret and apply the law, if I may say so, even more broadly. Be that as it may, those of us who are required to interpret and apply the law have, in my view, so very much to learn from the work. I'll just take one particular example from the book. Professor Stewart's work refers to the work of Paul McDaniel, identifying 6 elements necessary for an effective tax law, including things such as the tax unit, definition of the tax base, timing of taxation, the valuation of the tax base, the tax treatment of firms, and then the boundaries of the jurisdiction to tax. She then connects this work with the work of Christopher Hood in his examination of the British tax system, where he identifies the 6 administrative elements of a successful tax system as being tax units, channels, base value, data enforcement, and then reinforcement. And it's from these considerations that Professor Stewart lays out these administrative elements and explains how they're strikingly similar to the elements Paul McDaniel had identified as necessary for an effective tax law. Professor Stewart then goes on to say what then is revealed is that governments must and do co-opt and rely on actors external to government, like employers, to assist with critical aspects of those elements. As Miranda also points out, as society and the economy has changed and developed, both globally and digitally, the range of external actors used in connection with the collection of tax has broadened to include not only entities like financial institutions and corporations, but also digital platforms like Amazon and Google. So why is that important to us? It seems to me that those who design and administer the tax system and those who interpret and apply the tax law now must recognise that these interconnections not only exist and are necessary for an effective tax system, but also that they are interconnections which must be understood in the very wider context that Professor Stewart has identified in the book. Put in different terms, no aspect of taxation in the 21st century can be considered, let alone understood, without taking into account the broader social, political, technological, environmental and economic contexts in which the tax system and particular laws must exist, operate and be efficient. The tax system is no longer just a tax system. It is a system which affects the way in which society exists and operates at every level of human endeavour, and the effects flow both ways. Society, the law and tax law in particular can no longer be conceived, considered or continued in any form of silo. So this book caused me to reflect that the silos that I was concerned about 12 years ago are just some of the jigsaw pieces. The other pieces are those identified so clearly and articulately by Professor Stewart. Pieces which impact every part of human life and human endeavour. And that is where and why, in my view, this book is just so significant and so important. It's not fragmented. It addresses the issues of taxation and government in light of an extraordinarily broad range of interdisciplinary ideas and theories, and it does it so in a way which is both intellectually rigorous and, I must say, accessible. And that, on any view, is no small feat for which Miranda should be unbelievably proud and congratulated. My hope, indeed my expectation, is that this book will cause so-called tax experts, as well as non-tax analysts, to stop, think, engage and reflect, leading to a more robust, informed and efficient tax system with so many associated benefits to society. The elements necessary, I identified earlier, which are set out in the book for an effective tax law, may not have changed, but the context in which they are created and operate certainly has changed, fundamentally. The old status quo of tax experts and other legal specialists operating in distinct silos, leading to a misunderstanding of the tax ramifications of a particular law and to an underappreciation on the part of the tax experts of the potential influence of tax laws on society or a particular part of society, is no longer the norm, or at the very least substantially reduced. In other words, tax laws cannot drive our society, but they can and should shape our society, and they must do so not only having regard to, but with an understanding of the very much wider context identified by Professor Stewart. A series of self-referential silos is no longer appropriate or possible. Designing a tax system in that way is complex and has its own issues. As identified in the book, the risk of translating one discipline's problems into another discipline is just one example. But what this book shows is that it is possible not only to identify and address interdisciplinary issues in a way which is intellectually rigorous, but that we must do so if we are to meet the societal changes in the 21st century. Slowing economic growth, globalisation and digitalisation of the economy, ageing and longer living populations, changing nature of family, inequality of wealth and income, the gig economy, technological change, global health, and of course the environmental and resource challenges. We can no longer use the old playbook. We need to write a new playbook. And this book, in my view, contributes substantially and significantly to that new playbook. And unless we use the new playbook in designing tax policy, public finance and the tax state, so that we might address the difficult issues that we face in the 21st century globally, the choices we make, I think both political and non-political, will put at risk what this book shows to be interconnected: our democratic institutions, our economic system, and our political and non-political stability. A failure to do so will mean that there will not be what Professor Stewart refers to as a good democracy, but a risk, in my view, of serious threats to democracies. I am absolutely honoured and delighted to launch Tax Government in the 21st Century, and you please join me in congratulating Professor Miranda Stewart on a remarkable work. I'm detached.
You're detached. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful speech and for agreeing to launch the book. I've known Michelle and looked up to her as one of our sort of heroes of taxation in Australia for many, many years, and it's really an honour, so I'm really grateful. I've got a couple of wonderful people on a panel to have a little bit of a discussion about a couple of the other things in the book. Thank you also to the Dean for opening up this launch. But I thought I'd just make a couple of remarks and some thank yous. Before I do that, I'd like to add my acknowledgements of country to those who've come before us. And I'd also like to say that the business of fiscal governance, that is the organisation of government in a nation that comprises many, many nations and that fully recognises sovereignty, is also unfinished business. And in fact, I had the privilege about 10 years ago of beginning to work with Professor Marcia Langton on issues of how we might conceive of Indigenous fiscal governance and self-government in Australia in our federal structure of Commonwealth, state and local taxation. So that's the subject of another book, perhaps, in future, or certainly more research. So let me briefly say a couple of things about the book, and then I won't say all the many thank yous that I owe. This book has been nearly 10 years in the making. Very soon after I got the contract for it with Cambridge University Press, I was appointed to be the director of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Australian National University. And I went off and did that and promptly failed to do any writing under the contract for many, many years. So I'm grateful to the publisher for their their failure to tear up the contract is probably the best way to put it. You can't make authors write books, I suppose. Every now and then they achieve it. I'm sorry that there aren't books available here. If you did happen to want to get one, there are some flyers with a discount if you so wish. If you have access to the Melbourne University Library, it's also there. So the motivation for me writing this book nearly a decade ago, and then I learned so much over the last sort of decade of work as I've worked on it, was this issue of trying to think systemically about tax law. So tax law already, as Justice Gordon said, in the context of other areas of law, something that she and Her Honour and others have written about, and we always tell our tax lawyers, the rest of my colleagues will be pleased to know that they have to be good property lawyers and good equity lawyers and good trust lawyers and good administrative lawyers in order to be able to be good tax lawyers. But in the context of our social and economic structures, I think taxation today is kind of the lever or the interconnection between what I see as a good democracy and the market capitalist structures, national and global, in which we are embedded. And it perhaps is one of the saving graces that can actually prevent the full commodification of our lives, that can actually extract resources from that market economy for the public good and public benefit. And actually I've been inspired by some of the work of Matthew Harding, Dean, on charities in terms of recapturing the notion of public benefit, which is a core notion in charity law, and using it to expand the idea of public goods, which is a rather narrow economic concept and needs, I think, to be more broadly conceived. I'm at risk in the book of broadening everything, bringing everything in, and you'll all be horrified that actually tax is part of your lives all the time and really you'd prefer never to think about it at all. So I totally acknowledge that. But I do see tax law as a social process. It is a process of constructing our individual choices and lives vis-a-vis the state and with each other in the market, whether you like it or not. So I won't say any more about the book's content now. I do want to say some thank yous, obviously, again, to the Dean and Her Honour before I introduce my little panel, in particular to my family. So Justice Kristen Walker is somewhere here in the room, wherever she is, over there, and my son Alf Walker in the background here. As I do say in the acknowledgements, they were willing up to an indefined point when they tended to just turn away or to engage in regular dinner table conversation about why tax is important to everything. And the rest of our family, Graham Austin and Brian Patchett, some of you know Graham here at the law school upstairs, also professed on more than one occasion to be very interested in tax law. Obviously, my other family, my parents and my sister, and I'm really grateful to all of them, and in particular also to colleagues and mentors here and at other universities, and in particular co-authors. So there's a huge number of citations in this book because really I just couldn't stop reading and learning from colleagues in Australia and around the world. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Alfie, in particular. Thank you to the school for being supportive over many years. Let me introduce a couple of people who are going to say some interesting things, I hope, to have a little discussion. I mean, I know they'll say interesting things, that is bad. They will say interesting things. It's really fortunate that we have RJ Mahorotra here visiting at this time, so it was really serendipitous. Professor Mahorotra is a research professor of law, William G. and Virginia K. Carnes Research Professor of Law at Northwestern in the United States, and also a professor of history and very knowledgeable about that. I've been very familiar with RJ's work for many years and have tried on more than one occasion to build research projects with him. People who've experienced the Australian Research Council grant process will know what a painful process that is. But we will, I hope, work together one day. But in particular, RJ is the author of a book called Making a Modern American Fiscal State, which looks at the US history in the 20th century of the tax state, from which I've learned a lot, and also fiscal sociology. And then I'm also really delighted to have Danielle Wood here, leader of the Grattan Institute, as many people will know, and also a strong sort of expert on issues of budget repair, tax policy and reform in the Grattan Institute. So certainly does work in that space. She leads that budget program, and with a budget coming up in a few months, possibly has things to say on that. So we're going to pass to RJ to make a few remarks, first of all, and then to Danielle, and then we might have a bit of time for a bit of a discussion and Q&A.
So I am not a Supreme Court justice, but I'm going to try to see if I can learn that.
It's a challenge. It's a special skill of ours.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Miranda, for that very generous and kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join this book panel. Let me also thank the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law, of course, and the University of Melbourne Law School for hosting my visit this week. It was a very nice coincidence. Serendipity allowed me to be here at a time when this book launch was occurring and to be part of this panel. Let me also echo others in acknowledging and paying my respects to ancestors and elders of this land, past, present, and emerging. It really is a tremendous honor and pleasure for me to be here because, as Miranda already alluded, we've been tax law colleagues for many, many years, and I've been a great admirer of her work. Many ways in awe of her work, her productivity, as I'm going to say some few words in just a minute. But I do remember when we started talking about this panel, I also reflected back on this very bold and ambitious research proposal we put together, a sort of, I think, 3-continent, 2 millennia fiscal federalism proposal that was apparently too bold and ambitious for the Research Council. Far too ambitious. But I learned early on, very early on then that Miranda had the panoramic view of tax that I very much appreciate. And this project, this book is an example of exactly that. And so let me, in my brief time, 10 minutes or so, try to do sort of 3 things. I want to first, most importantly, echo others and elaborate by celebrating and congratulating Miranda for this very important achievement. This isn't her first book, or likely her last, as we heard from Dean Harding, the titles of some of her earlier books. By my count, I think she's got 5 original monographs, not including tax law case books. This is the awe-inspiring part as I was going through them. Wow. And she was doing all this administrative work at ANU. I'm thinking, wow, this is amazing. And so as many of you know, it's sort of customary at these important book launch events to continue to heap great praise on the author. And so I will be doing my share of heaping great praise. And part of that will be to really identify some main contributions that I think it makes to the literature. From my perspective as an interdisciplinary tax law scholar from the United States, there are a number of contributions. I'll try to pinpoint 2 or 3 in my brief time. And then I thought I would conclude with some brief questions, some sort of thought-provoking, right? I sort of had some questions that got us discussion going about some implicit parts of the books that Miranda might want to be more explicit about. So let me start with the congratulations and celebration. As many of you know, the process of writing a book is always a challenging process. It's frequently a solitary one. Single-authored book means a lot of work, a lot of drudgery, a lot of academic time ensconced in libraries and office working by themselves is what scholars do. And too often, highly productive scholars like Miranda, again, for her 6th original monograph, he says with MD, usually move on to the next research project, right? This is how you become a productive scholar. You finish the book and you go on to the next. And I understand there's already 1 or 2 other projects floating around. Again, he says with awe. But I think it's important, really, to take a moment to reflect and to bask in the exhilaration and afterglow of a book's publication. And one way to do that is to heap this kind of, I actually once heard a very prominent American social scientist in a Scotch Bowl, when she had a book launch event of her own. She said that academic authors should spend at least half as much time basking in the glow of a major book project as it takes to write it. And so 10 years might be right. Well, given the CV productivity, I think we have 6 months at the rate that Miranda has been going. So I want to add to that because it really is an incredible project, a project that follows on a long line of incredible interdisciplinary research productivity on tax law. And so let me get to that, the main contributions as I continue to heap my share of praise on this book. One of the most important, I think, contributions this book makes is the incredibly comprehensive synthesis of the extant interdisciplinary literature on tax law and policy. It's not just on tax law and policy. It's really on almost every aspect of fiscal policy, public finance, from the fundamental principles guiding tax policies to issues of budgeting, to distributive justice, to the upcoming challenges of tax systems in a more globalized and digital world, and much more on top of that. What I found particularly exciting about the book as I read it through was it's an incredible interdisciplinary scope. From the canonical early work of 20th century writings of Joseph Schumpeter and Rudolf Goldscheid, which is only in the original German, so I'm not quite sure how Miranda pulled that one off, to the mid-20th, to the mid-20th century work of Richard Musgrave, and right up to some of the leading tax scholars of today, including, most importantly, some of the critical tax scholars, folks who have really taken gender equity and racial equity seriously. Lisa Phillips' work, Dorothy Brown. It's all in here in under 400 pages, a real tour de force. It's really incredible amount of the breadth of the literature. In fact, as I was reading through the first couple of chapters, I kept circling footnotes. And thankfully, they're footnotes, not endnotes. You can kind of keep going. So I'm circling the footnotes going and writing a little marginalia. Must read. Must add to Tax 1 class syllabus. Must add to tax policy seminar. And then it took me about 4 chapters to realize there's a bibliography. It's a wonderful bibliography for the students in the audience and faculty, heavy faculty preparing for class. That alone is worth the price of admission. Just an incredible synthesis that goes on in the comprehensive nature of the topics. Not only just the topics covered, but also the way she juxtapositioned some of the discussions is really astonishing. In fact, there was a very surprising aspect of the book as I was reading through it. And I don't think I can think of any other book about tax law and policy that contains both an analysis of legal philosopher Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to gender equality alongside neoclassical economist James Mirrlees' optimal tax theory, all in the same book. Better yet, it's all on the same page. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with these authors, these are not two people one thinks about in the same page. I'll let you see how Miranda actually reconciles and circles that square, but it's a fascinating way to bring together. This is what interdisciplinary scholarship is really about, not siloing off in chapters, but bringing together these seemingly disparate ideas to show what they have in common. A second major contribution of the book, of course, is the examination of Miranda refers to as the fiscal bargain, or the importance of the fiscal bargain or the fiscal compact. In fact, it's kind of the through line, in my opinion, of the entire book. And this is really important because for Miranda, the fiscal bargain or fiscal compact really requires, first and foremost, this kind of negotiated agreement between taxpayers on the one hand who agree to this system of quasi-voluntary compliance, as Margaret Levy, the political scientist, put it, in exchange for a legitimate system of democratic governance, as Justice Gordon was just saying about the good society, the good democracy. Bringing those two things together in this fiscal compact is critical to this book, and it really provides a kind of narrative thread, as I read it, throughout all the many chapters. And she best describes this, I think, a little later in the book. I thought I would have liked it in the introduction, but the best, I thought, description was really when she's talking about the increasing use of public debt by modern democracies. And she writes, quote, "Taxation remains central to the fiscal compact even when debt financing has become widespread because taxation is the most transparent, politically contestable process for negotiating the allocation and distribution of resources in society and the economy." And that just very succinctly really captures so much of what the book is about. It really becomes in many ways a touchstone for the rest of the book. Now, just to be clear, there are other parts that address some of the more conventional issues of citizenship and taxation, especially that last section that Justice Gordon talked about on the tax state and global and digital economy. But I think Miranda, with the fiscal bargain, is focusing on a much more fundamental, much more profound philosophical aspect of taxation. And that's how taxation embodies the modern social contract. It is the pact between citizens and the state, between subjects and sovereign. The rights and duties of both citizens and states matter. The responsibilities of paying taxes, the rights to protest against illegitimate taxes, and then the fair and equitable distribution of taxes and the allocation of those resources on the state side are critically important. Other scholars have referred to this as physical citizenship, arguing that because taxation is one of the most widely and persistently experienced relationships that most people have in the modern world with their state, tax law defines the social and cultural meaning of citizenship. This is what I think Miranda is getting at with her conception of fiscal government. It's about using tax to forge a kind of civic identity. that is critically important, whether it's at the nation-state level or at a more global level. The third major contribution, I want to make sure I'm keeping to my time here, of the book is, of course, focusing on the all-important issue of inequality and the relationship between tax policies and what we've seen in growing inequality in liberal democracies. This topic is, of course, a very hot-button issue throughout most of the world, but what Miranda does is go beyond just the conventional discussions of income and wealth inequality, which are usually what most people focus on when they talk about inequality and the role the tax system has in that. She also examines how tax shapes gender and racial inequality. Right? She's already a well-known expert in the gender area, and I think Dean Harding already mentioned one of her earlier books, and then productivity. She keeps coming back over how many books there have already been. But in addition to that, there's a particular chapter that looks, chapter 5 on the family tax unit, really, I think, summarizes in a very cogent and succinct manner all the ways in which seemingly gender-neutral tax policies have, in fact, a disparate impact on women, all the empirical evidence that has been gathered over the decades about this. And so this is a really an important issue to the contribution on our discussions of inequality. Let me now conclude with a couple of thought-provoking questions. I know I'm running out of time here, so let me get to those. And let me pick up where I left off on this notion of inequality. It's really, Miranda focuses on inequality in a number of ways, but I want to push her a little bit more on the normative, which is, I think, a little bit underplayed in this book. This is, of course, an objective, scholarly, neutral book. It's not a polemic of any kind, but all of us scholars kind of smuggle our normative in one way or the other. There are places where I tried to pick up on it, but I want to push her to be a little bit more explicit about some of her normative, and then I want to push her a little bit on some of the empirical aspects. So let's talk a little bit about addressing economic inequality and what some normative solutions might look like. Because that's implicit in the book. If you read between the lines, you can tell that distributive justice is very important to Miranda and her worldview, but I'd like to know more about what she thinks are the most effective ways in addressing these inequalities that she's identified. Are broad-based and higher direct and progressive taxes, a global wealth tax, deductions for childcare. There's a number of things that are kind of lurking in the background of the book, but aren't actually spelled out. I think it would be very helpful. This is a topic of particular interest in many liberal democracies like the U.S., where there's, I think, a historical preoccupation when we talk about economic inequality in the U.S., a preoccupation, and some might say obsession, with what I would call high-end progressivity. What is colloquially known in the U.S. as soaking the rich. Other countries, by contrast, address inequality by focusing more on the other end of the socioeconomic scale, by lifting up those on the bottom, by designing more robust anti-poverty laws and policies. Where, I wonder, where does Miranda stand on these issues? We have this great panoramic view, but I'd like to know more about where Miranda Stewart's views are on combating inequality. And then finally, one of the areas that's a little bit underdeveloped, in my opinion, in the book is race as a category of analysis. As I mentioned, the book has several excellent discussions of gender inequality and how tax laws throughout the world, again, it's a comparative global monograph on the relationship between tax and gender. But what about race? What is the relationship between taxation and racial subordination? I don't pretend to know what's been going on in Australia, but I can tell you in the U.S., this is, of course, a very important issue. And in fact, I was really impressed that in her brief discussion of race, she does mention that President Joe Biden did issue an executive order to look requiring U.S. agencies to actually gather more data and look into this issue. And in fact, the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, just issued a report a month ago looking at some of these issues. So there is new stuff, but I'd like to know a little bit more about race as a category of analysis for inequality. And so let me conclude here, let me end where I began, again, by congratulating Miranda and celebration of the publication of yet another book in her highly productive career. May she rejoice in the afterglow, as I was
You might as well go straight. I might respond to some of those critiques in a minute, but I'm going to pass to Dana. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I am neither a justice nor a professor, so I'm going to hold the microphone, and I'm not sure my address is particularly microphone-friendly. But I also want to begin by congratulating Miranda. as someone that spends my life thinking a lot about tax policy, I didn't read it over summer on the beach, but I have been carrying it around a lot. And, you know, I know that it's one of those books that I will keep on the shelf and refer to again and again. And actually, speaking of carrying it around, I've been sort of dipping into it a lot over the past week in preparation for tonight, and it's been quite a surreal experience. So on the one hand, I'm sort of opening this book and I have Miranda's very measured, very thoughtful reflections on tax policy. On the other hand, I've been following the media debates around super tax changes, and the difference in tone is remarkable. So my opening provocation is actually, how do we get a little less hysteria and a little more Miranda into our public tax debates in this country? We need to have these debates. My starting point for a tax discussion, as Miranda says, I come from a budgetary sort of lens, assumes that we need to raise more revenue over time. The reason I say this is that we have expanded the size of government in recent times. If you look at the budget papers, it says that over the next decade, our federal government will spend about 27% of GDP. That compares to what has been a longer-term historical average of about 25% of GDP. Why has that happened? We have decided as a society that we would like to spend more on people in aged care, on people with a disability. We want to spend more on health as new and better technologies become available. We're going to spend more on defence as a share of the economy because of the broad geopolitical tensions. At the same time, the same is true of state governments. In Victoria, even if we look just before COVID, the size of Victorian government spending as a share of the state economy grew from 12 to 15%. Next year it will reach 19%. We've had this extraordinary expansion in the size of governments and what we expect them to do, but we haven't had a conversation yet, I think it's fair to say, as a nation about how we pay for that. So at the federal level, structural budget deficits, stripping out all the cyclical stuff, is now sitting at around 2% of GDP or $15 billion a year. So if you're like me and you do not think it is a good idea for governments to run persistent big structural deficits and have debt creeping as a share of the economy when times are good, we have to talk about tax. We're not going to get there on spending restraint alone. For those that attend, we can, while capping tax as a share of the economy at the sort of Howard era levels, the 23.9% tax cap that we hear about sometimes. I just ask, where is that $50 billion of spending restraint going to come from? That is more than the total size of the defence budget. It is more than the NDIS and JobSeeker combined. It is 5 times larger in real terms than the cuts to spending that were made in the 2014-15 so-called horror budget, most of which actually didn't end up happening because it was seen as too unpopular. So if we have any hope of a path to long-term fiscal sustainability, and as others have said, Miranda covers some of the longer-term challenges around ageing population, decline in productivity, shift to digital in her book as well. All of those loom on the horizon. If we're going to have any chance of getting there, we need to talk about tax, but we need to think about ways to raise revenue that are as efficient as possible, that have the least possible economic drag. We need them to be fair, at least maintaining the progressivity of the system, and we want them to be not too complex. And this is where I think, Miranda's thoughtfulness really comes into play. So Miranda makes the case, I think persuasively, that we have shifted our equilibrium in the tax system over time to one where we undertax wealth and assets. I firmly agree with that observation. It is not a focus of Miranda's book, but I would add into the mix the need for better resource taxation particularly in Australia, we're not getting a fair share of the resource wealth coming out of this country. And I would also add the need to tax externalities better. So, for example, pricing of carbon would be the single most efficient way to address climate change. In the absence of a political motivation to move in that direction, we could be at least looking at some shadow prices in the high emission sectors. So I'm going to be putting out some work with some Grattan colleagues shortly on a menu of options for budget repair, looking at that both the tax and spending side of the budget. But on the tax side of the budget, we'll be talking about things like winding back more generous tax concessions to super, reducing the capital gains tax discount, addressing tax planning through trusts, reforms to petroleum resource rent taxes, reduction in fuel tax credits. If we were looking at state budgets, that's just the federal budget, I would add in broad-based land taxes, congestion pricing. These are the economically responsible ways that we will start addressing structural budget deficits. They are also entrees into tax reform. If we build more resilient and more efficient tax bases, that provides scope to reduce our reliance on less efficient taxes over time. So I want to come back to that opening question about why it is the tax conversation in this country sometimes borders on the historical. Every time a change is proposed that suggests that someone should go backwards, other than, of course, Bracket Creek, which picks up taxes all the time and nobody says anything. But let's use this week's super tax discussion as a case study. The government tried to start a national conversation about super and its objectives. Within about 3 minutes, I think the media pivoted to talking about tax. The government should have been prepared for that, frankly. It didn't seem to be. But when we think about the tax treatment of super, the fact that we give generous tax concessions over the life cycle such that people pay considerably less tax on income there than they do through other sources. We do that, of course, because we have a policy goal that we want people to save enough so that they can have a dignified retirement. But those tax breaks now cost nearly $15 billion a year, soon to overtake the age pension in terms of spending, 2/3 of which are flowing to the top 20% of income earners. None of them are going to have a problem reaching the level of savings associated with a comfortable retirement. And they have become a massive tax planning opportunity for high income earners. By 2060, about 1/3 of those tax rates, 1/3 of withdrawals from super are going to be paid out through bequests. So this has become a taxpayer-funded inheritance scheme. In a world where we have a budget challenge, this is a huge source of revenue leakage and not well targeted to the policy goal that is set up to address. That would seem to me to be a very good place to start this conversation. But the conversation was really quickly derailed. Even though Labor clarified very quickly it was focusing on very high value accounts, 3 million or more. The proposal was dubbed a new front in the super wars, a death tax by stealth, likely to strike fear in the heart of middle Australia. Front page of the major tabloids, wall-to-wall coverage in the 2 national papers. It generated over 1,000 media mentions in a fortnight. That is just written media mentions, according to Factiva. That is for a policy that will raise less than $1 billion a year and impact 80,000 people. Now, I'm just going to contrast with Labor's policy on more affordable childcare. That is expensive. It will cost over $1 billion a year. It will benefit 1.26 million families. It goes to some of the challenges that Miranda touches on in her book around high effective tax rates for secondary earners who are mainly women. That has received the same amount of media coverage over a year, which included an election in which it was a major policy focus. So there is an incredible sensitivity in public debates to changes in tax that I do think makes it harder to shift the dial. So that's my negative side. The positive side of me is going to say it is not impossible to shift things. We shouldn't confuse media excitement with an inability to bring the public along in these debates. My reading is that where people do the hard work of tilling the ground and explaining changes, hearts and minds can shift. So if I dare go there, I'll use negative gearing policy as an example. later started talking about this back in 2014. At the time, it was seen as sort of an untouchable of Australian tax policy. Polling at the time showed that only 30% of Australians supported any change. As the case was made, as it was over 5 years, we saw public support begin to inch up. By the time of the 2019 election, support for the proposed change was at 57%. The media will say that that policy lost them the election, but it was popular at that point in time, actually, particularly in those electorates where more people were actually using it. So, again, what I take away is that where people do the hard work, where they make the explanations, we can shift minds even in a hostile media environment. So that brings me back to Miranda. We are so lucky in this country to have someone like Miranda with her expertise and her capability. She doesn't just do heavy academic lifting, and I agree that her productivity is remarkable, but she also participates in these public debates. So I think ultimately the only way to get more Miranda into our tax debates is to have more Miranda in our tax debates. I am so glad that she has written this book, and I am hopeful that it can be the start of a more sensible discussion around tax, because we certainly need it. Thank you, Miranda.
So, look, we've got two such wonderful people on the panel. I don't want to keep us all very long, and there's more of a drink outside. I thought we might have a little bit of time for kind of a little bit of Q&A if people want. So we only have one microphone. I won't complain about the university's budget structures very much. But getting more microphones in this room was beyond our capability. Perhaps a normative framework is needed. Anyway, I won't go there. Just before I pass that, so the work that Danielle does and the Grattan Institute does, I think, bridges sort of some of the academic work, and Grattan is very good. I think the researchers there are very good at reading and parsing that academic literature and bringing it into policy context. So it's really great to hear Danielle saying that they are doing some more work on budget repair. You might not be surprised to know that, there are other important policy fields out there. Some, and it's not always easy, not just in terms of the political debate about tax, but actually even in terms of building policy analysis and sort of the input that the Grattan Institute does and other think tanks do, careful policy work, is often sort of not supported or funded because tax is just too unpopular or too difficult to engage with. So I'm really glad Grattan's doing some of that work. I might make a couple of comments about RJ's remarks as well, and then come back to Danielle, and then I wanted to come back to you and open up if anyone has anything further. So about the normative stuff. What can I say? So I have a couple of responses. One is a claim that actually I am making some normative judgments in this book without necessarily coming down on the side always of one tax reform or another, or one policy or another. And the normative claims I'm making, I think, are deeper and more structural. So more about this fiscal bargain. That is, that actually it behoves us as members of a democratic society, and we should expect our governments and demand our governments to think really hard about this and to actually take it seriously, to take this fiscal relationship seriously. I have a really strong faith, despite everything, in both democratically elected politicians and even business operating in a market economy. Bill Easterly, who was a critique of international development institutions and frameworks, I wouldn't always agree with in his critique, but one of the things that he said was that the true innovators actually are businesses in the market economy and democratically elected politicians. So, with the best will in the world as an academic and as a kind of policy thinker and theorist, what I'm trying to do is build the tools for that debate to happen in a way that is actually valuable to society, supports the well-being of society rather than counterproductive. And I'm not a political scientist and certainly not a politician, but that idea of trying to enrich democratic debate. And I think that's part of what Danielle is calling for. I do also think that in terms of normative recommendations, context matters a lot. So I might sometimes argue that we should raise tax rates on the top, or we should enact an inheritance tax. But it depends. It sort of depends on the context. It depends not only on the politics of the day, but on the economic and social context, on the way assets are held, on the structure of the economy, on the opportunities for avoidance and evasion or for global connection. That will tell us whether it's desirable or feasible to do that policy at that time. So I'm kind of hedging my bets a bit. You're not the first, to be honest, to have pointed out that I hedge my bets a bit on some of the normative goals and policy goals in the book, but I'm trying to kind of give a reason for that. And you're absolutely right to point out the issue of racial inequality. So I do refer a little bit in the book to what we could think of as critical race scholarship, which is really at its most advanced in the US and to a lesser extent in Europe. And in particular, the way that tax law, like property law, like our inheritance of even planning and zoning law and the way that land is held and divided and stolen, is a distributional, a racially unequal distributional mechanism of the state. Sorry, today. And what's interesting in the US is that this is starting to come out in empirical data, and that sort of work has not really been done in Australia. In terms of gender equality, in the book, one of my key goals, and the cover has a group of women dancing on the street. I've told a few people in this room that to me that's the epitome of a society that is well governed. It's a society where women are free, and where dancing is perceived as a good thing. So one of my goals in the book was really to fully integrate the several decades of gender critical analysis that have been done over the years of tax policy, to integrate that into the narrative of the book. And I certainly have done that less well in terms of race. So I'll stop there in terms of my kind of comments, except that I do support the super tax reform that has been announced, a small step that it is. I don't know whether Joe or Danielle would like to make any other comments or responses.
We've got a great turnout here on the
So we've got about 10 minutes without wanting to keep people back from drinks. If anyone would like to ask a question, we can bring the mic around. Otherwise, I'm very happy to have a drink. Those of you who are here to, as you say, bask or at least for half an hour. Tax, Chris, Judge.
No, I was so interested, Danielle, in what you said about...
Give you the microphone just in case.
Chris Maxwell. So interested in what you said about the inevitably toxic quality of any discussion about tax, and it's accompanied by the bipartisan push for lower tax rates over decades, with occasional advocacy reminding us that we all do want better public services and education and health and so on, and that there does need to be a revenue base. It's one thing to say government could have done better in laying the groundwork for this proposal, but I suppose I'm interested in your sense of how we change the climate for discussion. It's as if neither dominant political party will spend time making the case for public spending, public goods, public institutions, in order to educate us in advance of a debate about a higher tax rate to pay for it. I'm just interested in your thoughts about how we can make it possible to have the sort of rational discussion about tax which our needs and wants as a society make so desperately necessary.
Yes, look, it's a wonderful question. And I think you're right, it's actually tilling the ground in advance. And I think one of the challenges in tax debate is it happens removed from those other considerations. So somebody will put up a proposed change to tax. Invariably, people lose. The debate will heavily feature those losers, and we never talk about the flip side. Why are we doing this? Who wins? What are we trying to fund? All of that. So you do sort of have to start there, or at least by trying to make the trade-offs to people more clear. And the alternative is kind of put your head in the sand and just keep running with deficits, and that has the generational implications. So I think we need to start there. I was listening to Martin Wolf's just put out a book on sort of democratic capitalism, and he was, this is a podcast with him today, he was saying, we've got to start changing the conversation to think about ourselves as citizens, not just as workers or business owners, or it's not just what's in it for me, it's sort of this broader sense of the community purpose and the public goods that we've been talking about tonight. That is hard to change. I would like to have, I do think the media doesn't cover these issues well, and they sort of revert back very quickly to let's find someone that loses and put them on the front page, and there really is a massive asymmetry in coverage, which is what I was trying to get to, the childcare versus the tax question, in terms of just the amount of coverage that these issues get and the disproportionateness of the coverage that you get even for a small change, which is essentially what the change today was. So something that we do is try and educate media on scale, that kind of matters as well, so that the debate is at least kind of proportionate to the scale of the change. But this is not easy, and I think we've gone so far down this road, it's quite hard to change what have become a sort of series of reflexive or entrenched positions when things are announced.
We've seen the US.
Yeah, I'm interested actually how it differs.
I think it's very similar. A toxic environment, I think, was the way it was named. I think that's right. I mean, at this point, even just maintaining some of the social entitlements that the United States committed to requires more revenue. And at this point, in the last, and Miranda does a terrific job throughout her book on what she calls the supply side shift to lower tax rates that we're still living with. It's not just in Australia. I think this is a global phenomenon, certainly in the US. Tax cuts at any context. So unlike Miranda's very measured response to my push on normative about the importance of context, it seems like the American right believes that tax cuts is a solution for everything. Even during wartime, I mean, I was astonished in the wake of 9/11 during a very traumatic moment for the United States. One of our right-leaning leaders spoke up that tax cuts are the best thing for wartime. And I thought, oh my gosh, what an incredibly ahistorical comment. That's really not what anyone would have said in World War II. Right? And so this notion, this idea that somehow tax cuts are the solution to every problem, I think is a local.
Can I just add something, because I happen to have been reading Thomas Piketty,
Yes, of course.
A brief history of equality, and he points out that as tax rates went up in the early part of the 20th century, so did economic growth. And I gather Australian economic history reveals the same trend. So the proposition that you need to cut taxes to drive economic growth is empirically false.
I think that's probably it. So I don't want to. So again, I'm going to be sitting on the fence again. One more question over here. I think we've got one more question. In terms of tax cuts, we can kind of obsess about this as an issue too, and we should be thinking more systemically about actually building a kind of a prosperous economy as a whole, which will then support our sort of public goods. But one of the things I try to argue in the book is that we need to think about resilience of these systems, and resilient systems are not always the most optimized or the most efficient. They are systems that are adaptable to unpredictable changing circumstances. And there are moments of reform. The abolition of the estate tax in Australia is one of them, where it might have seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a complicated
unfair, highly avoided and planned tax that raised very little revenue. Why would you keep a tax like that in the system? Kind of makes sense, just clean slate. Let's get rid of it. But I do think that now, in the long term, we are now 4 decades later, grappling with the consequences of having, instead of reformed that tax, which needed reform, of having eliminated it. And we are working out ways, taxing superannuation on that, and other ways that are politically unpopular and difficult to try to capture some balance in the system. I guess time for one more question, and then I really will stop.
You're taking me now. No, but my name is Natasha, and I'm currently a master's student here. My question is not very specific to your book, I'm sorry. It's actually to Professor Miranda, since you come to the US, and I have been, of course, working in the estate space for about 5 years now, back home in India, at what, in my opinion, is the best law firm in India, especially in the private line space. But just generally, we've debated a lot with my colleagues, my ex-colleagues, and of course my mentors as well at the firm. We often talk about why is there, we have federal level estate tax in the US, and we have state level inheritance tax in the US. Some states have both. They say, well, people move to Florida because they want to save taxes. I just want to know what do you think, in your professional, personal, opinion, why is there inheritance tax in the US when a lot of the other countries do not have it? I mean, I'm not saying that other countries are correct, but just your opinion on the US's policy on this space.
Yeah.
On the estate tax in particular.
The estate
Well,
tax of relevance to Australia.
Sure. Well, let me broaden the question a little bit. Just say transfer of wealth taxation. Right? That's how we would generally categorize that.
Yeah.
And the U.S. has had a, let's say, complicated history with it. And it gets very much to Danielle's points about the way things are packaged and framed. There was actually a very brief period where there was no estate tax. That was more kind of legislative mishap. But the arguments for why there should be are, a lot of it is about politics. And the symbolism of requiring massive amounts of wealth to prevent dynastic wealth transfer from happening. And so some of it is politics and the symbolism of politics, but when it gets reduced, as it's been in the U.S. over the years, that's often the same story Danielle was just telling about what's going on here, which is the way these things are framed. So when it was first discussed, there's a wonderful book called by a political scientist and tax law scholar called Death by a Thousand Cuts. And it demonstrates, it's written like a political novel, beach-like reading. It's really that good a book. And it just demonstrates how, in one of the chapters is entitled, How Stories Trump Statistics. And so when you get a farmer to tell a story about how he's the third generation, he's going to lose his farm because of that, that plays powerfully in the media and among lawmakers. But when you look at the statistics, it is 0.11% of people who actually lose farms, right? Who lose farms because of it. Meaning the actual implications of that. Yes, the stories trump the statistics. And that's why in the world of politics, that's what wins.
So is it fair to say that
we might
talk afterwards.
So just as a little aside on farms, of course, farms were a big reason why the estate tax was abolished in Australia. Again, reform might have been better, and you might like to know, which is something I have in the book, that in the UK, farms are excluded from the inheritance tax, and therefore, surprise, surprise, quite a lot of rich people are buying farms. So just to bring us back to the behavioural implications of these things. So, look, I feel like it's might be my story now. I guess I get to draw it to a close. I really want to thank Jane and Danielle, and I'm going to pass to Vivian to wrap up, and thank you so much.
Okay, the drinks are on the other side of that wall, so I'll be brief. I think what we've heard in this discussion is that this book is about a lot more than tax. It's really about all that we care about in the way our societies are ordered. And so it couldn't be more important. So thank you very much, Justice Gordon, for launching the book and for being here this evening.
RJ and Danielle, thank you very much for very thoughtful reflections. I've learned a lot from listening to you both. And Miranda, congratulations, a wonderful achievement, and I'm sure we all look forward now to purchasing and reading the book. So thanks all for joining us and doing